Hi, this is Professor JPS, and this is a streamlined lecture for what would have been Communication Arts 154's last class, which sort of would have been held tomorrow, but not really, because tomorrow is that odd reading day. Since the beginning of the semester back in January, the semester started on a Thursday, which means that in order for it to be congruent with the rest of the Tuesday-only classes, you would have had a day off tomorrow and had a final next Thursday. So I'm just giving a review for the final examination, and then we'll email you all the final examination this evening, and you will have until next Thursday, May the 14th at midnight, to hand in the questions. There'll be four questions on the three last films, and then one basic question that tries to ask you to think a little bit more. So this will be the last YouTube video for the semester for this particular class. At least I'm pretty sure, unless there's some emergency video. And what I want to do is go over three films and aspects of the textbook that will help you. The three films are The 400 Blows, the French film, which I hope you're able to get a chance to see, and the film Forrest Gump, which I imagine most of you have seen, and the last film, Citizen Kane, which again I hope most of you were able to see. Okay. In terms of The 400 Blows, that was a film that we had seen when we were talking about Chapter 11, Critique, and we were talking a little bit about some of the ideas of theory, film theory, and when film theory became a bit more part of the academic world. Just a brief rundown on some of the things we discussed prior to seeing that French film, or hopefully you saw that French film, was that when you think about all of the other arts, literature, painting, sculpture, architecture, music, theater, they have all been studied for centuries, at least in Western culture, right? Classical music, the Renaissance, modernist paintings, jazz music. Those things have been studied at fine institutions in Europe, in the United States, and other parts of the world. Motion pictures, movies, on the other hand, are still relatively new when you compare them to those other ancient art forms. Motion pictures don't get started until 1895, and for the most part, motion pictures have been part of what's called popular culture, that is to say, not high culture, but so-called lower culture, that it's a commercial enterprise. It's a popcorn seller, right? And movies in America particularly, but also in Europe, from 1895 to about the 1930s or so, were not really thought of as artful. They were just thought of something you went to see to be entertained in the many genres in which people found compelling. Musicals, gangster films, dramas, romantic comedies, what have you. No one thought to compare them to literature or painting or any other art forms. Okay, so that's just a way to think about this. So along come, a number of people who, starting in the 30s and 40s and really culminating in the 1950s, they start to see film and filmmaking as there's a possibility that it could be seen as artful, dynamic, contemplative, thought-provoking, and not just part of a commercial industry churning out movies that are filled with cliches. Well, sometimes that is the case, but if you look carefully enough, you can see films with a little bit of an academician's eye, that is to say, like an academic, like someone looks at art history or someone looks at painting and sculpture and so forth. And in the lecture a few weeks ago, we did talk about a handful of critics, and we more or less discussed them as being on one side of the column that were the realists, and the other side of the column that were the formalists or expressionists in terms of their theoretical ideas. Okay. Now, I'm not going to hit you too hard over the head in the final exam about that. I just want you to have some grounding in how these theorists started to think about movies as something beyond just merely a commercial enterprise. And the camp of the realists said that the thing that's most powerful about motion pictures is the idea that they can depict real life in a very, very true way and make people think about their real lives in a way that literature quite didn't, in a way that theater quite didn't do, and in a way that was very visual and powerful and sort of made people feel something in a way that, even though it was an artificial medium as much as theater, it was draped in a kind of realistic aesthetic to make movies move you emotionally. And then you had the people who were the formalists who said, why reduplicate the world? We can use this film as magical. We can show interesting, fun, bizarre, weird, expressive stuff. Okay? Now, overwhelmingly, most films are realistically or depicted somewhat realistically. And even so, most films are, through the decades, particularly from Hollywood, aren't really that sophisticated. But as I mentioned, after World War II, there were a group of thinkers, particularly in France, who started to really, really put their foot to the gas, so to speak, in thinking about films as a kind of artful idea. And as I mentioned, the journal, the film journal called Cahiers du Cinéma, or Cinema Notes, was run by a French fellow called André Bazin, that's B-A-Z-I-N. And his real contribution to cinema was that he thought that motion pictures had a kind of emotional realism that made them worthy of academic study, that made them artful. Because for Bazin, he was more interested in realism than formalism. But for him, formalism was just as fine as realism as long as the characters themselves rang true. He didn't care if a movie maker showed off with lights, showed off with shadows, showed off with camera movement. He didn't even care if a film was about a fantasy world or whatever. What he cared about is whether or not the storyline rang true with a sense of emotional realism and a sense of intimacy that connected to living, breathing human beings. And for him, realism was valuable because realism in film, I mean, because he thought that people could really feel something and understand their lives better while being entertained. And he championed, and he and his other acolytes at Cahiers du Cinéma championed this notion of the auteur theory. And the auteur theory suggests that it's the director who's the person most responsible for the artistic output of motion pictures. The director is king or queen, not the writer, not the actor, not even the technicians like cinematographers or lighters or people who work with sound, not the editors, not even the producers who pay for the film, not even the studio who makes the film, but it's the director, the person who's almost like the painter, right? You wouldn't even think about any other person besides the painter being the artist or the auteur or the painting, right? Because it's just that person with canvas and paint. In motion pictures, what these Cahiers du Cinéma critics were saying was that it's the filmmaker, the director is the person who collates all that stuff, all those other people together, and is the person most responsible for the artistic output of films. And that director has a recognizable style and a personality that comes through cinematically with repeated cinematic themes and styles that he or she visits regardless of genre, over and over and over again. Not unlike a musician has a particular kind of style, not unlike a painter, an architect, a playwright, or whatever. It's easily recognizable, okay? And we've mentioned before some of the auteurs in American filmmaking. Quentin Tarantino is certainly one of them. This guy Edgar Wright is one of them. Martin Scorsese is one of them. Woody Allen is one of them. and going back into movie makers like Alfred Hitchcock and Howard Hawks and so forth, okay? That's part of this idea of what was very important about the French New Wave. Page 450 in the textbook goes over a little bit of the differences between reviewers, critics, and theorists. Take a look at that, page 450. And then a little bit between 453 and 456. They give some examples of cinematic realism. And 465 through 471. 465 through 471 talks about the auteur theory and talks about the ideas of André Bazin and some of the movie makers that allowed for making films and filmmaking to be seen as much more artful, okay? Now, this is a repeat of some of the stuff we went through a couple weeks ago in the same lecture, similar lecture. Now, in terms of the film, The 400 Blows, okay, I just want to remind you of some of the elements of that particular film that give it this sense of realism, okay? First of all, the film in 1959 seems so fresh and so new to European and then American audiences. That's one thing. It was, even though if you had seen the film, you may have found it a little dull. I mean, it's old, I understand, and it's French and it's in black and white and it moves kind of slow. But believe me when I say this, it was somewhat refreshing because it felt so realistic and so not stodgy and so not Hollywood. And when I say Hollywood here, I mean French Hollywood, which is Paris, but you know what I mean? It seemed so less than conventional, but so utterly contemporary then of 1959 Paris. So that's one thing right off the bat. It was so different. It seemed to connect to a kind of realism that movies didn't normally connect to, okay? And the techniques that Truffaut uses in the film to get at that realism are the very point. And those techniques are on-location shooting. I mean, everything is shot on location, okay? In the streets of Paris, in the schoolhouses that the boy goes to, in the real apartments, in the real detention center that he goes to, in the real ball fields, in the real beach that he runs to. Everything is shot on location. Nothing is shot in a studio in this film. Okay, and if there is, it's like, it's probably one scene somewhere, but I don't think anything is shot anywhere but on location. Okay, the movie has some improvised acting. Again, that tends to give the film a sense of realism because that young kid, who's only like 15, he certainly had a script, but he would go off script to say whatever he felt like saying. And that one scene where the psychiatrist is asking him questions about his sex life, he didn't know that was coming. So he's answering honestly as much as he can as a character and as a real kid. And that was really refreshing, right? The film also had relatively mature and sad themes. And that was a bold choice. I mean, I think we're so used to happy endings, and this movie doesn't have happy ending at all. It's a very somber film. And again, that felt so refreshing and so not Hollywood, or Hollywood, French Hollywood, if you will, okay? The film uses long takes, lots and lots of long takes. Long takes means not that much editing. And when you don't have that much editing, that means you don't have a whole lot of activity. The realism is playing in front of you. All of the things that happen in that little school when he gets in trouble, it takes a while to get to him getting in trouble. When he has the conversations with his stepfather, when he has the conversations with his mother, they play out almost like they would in real life. When he has the difficulties at the detention school that he has to go to, the juvenile school that he has to go to, there's these lengthy scenes that play out. It plays out very realistically. And then that unbelievably long running shot at the end of the film where the boy escapes the detention center and he runs away from the soccer game outside that he's playing. He's running and running and running. He runs for something like a full 2 minutes of screen time. That never happens. I mean, you'd be bored to death in a movie like that now. Then it was so not the case that people were almost surprised that he didn't run longer. And then it has this open-ended, rather sad ending where he just looks at the camera once he reaches the ocean, and the movie just ends with a what do you call that? The screen just stops. And it was very, very somber, very, very sad, but realistic, and you feel a sense of that you haven't been lied to or cheated when you're watching the movie. Now, it's not everybody's cup of tea, and you're watching it, almost 60. You're watching it 60 years later, and it's not your culture, but it was a very influential film. It helped springboard the French New Wave, which ultimately then helped springboard the American New Wave about a decade later. Okay, that's what's, I think, very influential about it. Okay, and Truffaut was his first film, and he became an auteur filmmaker where many themes and styles are reflected historically in his movies. And in fact, on page 466, you can see a wonderful shot of a photo montage of that same character and that same actor through many, 4 different films in one shot. It's a very, very interesting shot. And this movie was roundly praised as a bold, innovative, new kind of filmmaking because it just seemed so realistic and emotionally realistic. And it was dedicated to Andre Bazin, who died tragically early. Okay? So consider those ideas about the French New Wave. It's in black and white. It's shot on location. It's a somber, sad tale. It has an open-ended ending. It doesn't have a happy ending. It has long, long takes. Also, it has this sort of music that's very, very almost bleak sounding, with just a hint of hope, because he's still a teenager. He still has his whole life to live. Okay, the music is not necessarily celebratory of this boy's life, but the key is a rather sad key. Okay, so the ingredients, the filmmaking ingredients, the mise-en-scène of the film lend to this bold choice to make a story about a juvenile delinquent, essentially, who comes to learn very hard lessons in life. And it's well acted, and it's a very, very beautifully told story. That's its main thread is realism. Realism is what it's about. Okay. So in terms of the 400 Blows and the French New Wave and auteur theory, these are 3 things sort of rolled into one. And the French New Wave was a way in which the filmmakers who had previously been critics at Cinema Notes or Cahiers du Cinéma try to use their ideas of how movies can be artful and powerful and emotionally realistic. And they took those ideas when they were writing about them and put them into motion into filmmaking. And the time period demanded a break from over-budget historical French dramas about, Louis XV with, big crazy wigs, or silly romantic comedies about pretty French women and handsome French men that didn't amount to much. This was trying to evoke something relatively serious and emotionally realistic, to get into the ideas of Andre Bazin and how cinema can move its camera in close, in intimacy, in reality. It's a nice film. You're not sure how to feel when you finish it. Okay. In terms of Forrest Gump, now Forrest Gump is pretty easy film to understand. I like Forrest Gump. I know that maybe some of my students get mad at me because I pick on Forrest Gump. I'm not trying to pick on Forrest Gump. I think it's a well-made movie, but I think it's a pretty good teaching tool in terms of ideology. And if we don't think too much about ideology, we then represent the ideology of a culture. We do anyway. But it's good to question your ideology to see what it means to have an ideology and see how movies reflect that ideology. And I tried to make the argument that Forrest Gump, on one level, is a very, very interesting movie. It has an A-level budget. It has good acting. It has really good use of music. It has, for the time period, pretty good special effects. And it's a large, sweeping historical film. And it has a very sympathetic character that you can't help feeling connected to emotionally, right? But if you dig a little deeper beyond that superficial understanding of the film, and you start to see how the changes of the latter 1950s and all the way through the 60s and early 70s, that very, very, the large period of upheaval with the civil rights movement, with the anti-Vietnam War movement, with some of the changes in feminism and later gay rights, and just some of the discord that happened during that time period. If you think about how that is channeled in the film, it's channeled through the libido or the mindset of a man who can't think. Now, I'm not trying to pick on Forrest Gump, the character, because of his inability to be able to think. He is an innocent and is a good person, but he can't think that well. So what you have in the movie is kind of a fable, a kind of whitewashing of those histories, right? I mean, the civil rights movement was much more combustible than merely picking up a notebook for a black student, which Forrest Gump does in the film. So an audience in 1993 or 2003 or 2023 watching Forrest Gump, they may feel so much sympathy for Gump that they overlook the real dangers and problems and courage that it took to change the things that were changed in the 60s. And it was a hell of a lot more than picking up a book for a black girl. I mean, people died. Lots of people died trying to integrate the South and make laws so that African Americans got their slice of the pie, so to speak. And in the film Gump, it doesn't really like those dangers. Not Gump the character, Gump the film. So it kind of makes it easier for audiences to think of it as almost like a VH1 Remember When moment. And it's not real. Now, not that it has to be real, right? I'm not saying that Forrest Gump has to be this realistic depiction of the South. But it chooses to make Jenny's boyfriend, who's a hippie, a bad guy who hits Jenny. It chooses to make his arguments ridiculous, blaming it on President Johnson in the Vietnam War. It refuses to treat women, the woman character, as anything other than a victim, right? I mean, she can think, but her character is raped by her father, becomes a transient person all through the 60s, becomes addicted to heroin, and gets AIDS and produces Gump 2, gets AIDS and then dies. Meanwhile, the guy who can't think gets everything, right? So on one level, you have this sort of film that's really satisfying to watch. Why is it so satisfying to watch? Because it takes all the difficulties and messes of the 60s and views them through the lens of a guy who says, life's like a box of chocolates. Life is nothing like a box of chocolates, right? So you can't help but feel for Gump. He's so sweet, and he's so nice, and he's so good, and he has so many tragedies, but he gets through them. But if you think about it, the overall message of the film is relatively regressive in its politics or backward in its politics. They're not progressive, right? And the one time that Gump is able to actually say something that has any value or meaning other than an aphorism, he's about to speak to a giant anti-Vietnam War rally, and they pull the plug on him, which is just kind of a dopey part of the film. It's like, it just seems really artificial when that happens. But part of the reason it happens is because the film then gets too real. It's almost like, was Gump going to have an anti-war position or a pro-war position, which was everything in 1968 or 69. But the movie doesn't want you to handle that. The movie wants you to have Jenny come in and save the day and whitewash that history again. It's a very tricky film, but that's how ideology works, right? it takes the shell of a little political era and makes it a kind of Hallmark card remembrance. And that, I would argue, would put you on page 411, where you have the ideological spectrum from communist to socialist to liberal to centrist to conservative to theocratic to fascist. And there's a list of films that represents all those political positions. Now, you've probably only seen one, maybe two of those films. But I would argue that Forrest Gump, without criticizing it, I would argue that its politics are relatively conservative, because it's taking what was considered to be a liberal time and making it easier for audiences 20-some, 30-some years later, 25 years later, to absorb without thinking about those changes of the 60s. Okay? And if you look at pages 414 and 415 and 416, they give some, the Giannetti, the textbook author, gives some ideas about certain kinds of films, allowing them their particular kinds of ideologies. And again, I'm not criticizing conservative filmmaking. That's not what I'm saying. I'm not saying conservative filmmaking bad, liberal filmmaking good. That's not what I mean. There's plenty of liberal films that are just lousy. And Forrest Gump's a good film. But what I'm saying is to think about the thing beyond just the surface. And I think Forrest Gump is a relatively conservative film in the same way that It's a Wonderful Life is. And there's pretty good examples about some of the films and how they're laid out in the ideological spectrum. Forrest Gump has some really good mise-en-scène too. I think that those things I mentioned, the music is particularly good at manipulating audiences to feel on Gump's side. And it has, great songs that are played in the film that really speak to the era. And it also has some very interesting, terrific acting by Tom Hanks. And, some dynamic camera movement and really good for the time period special effects. But it's really a political film. But people don't think of it that way. But it really is. And that's why I show it, because I think it's a good teaching tool to teach students about ideology. Okay. And, I would consider those ideas. And the last film has its own chapter. We talked a little bit about it last week. Citizen Kane. The key idea with Citizen Kane, as I mentioned last week, has to do with pages 490 through 495, and then also 500 and through 502, and page 509. Okay, so I'll just go over some of those ideas from those pages. Now, maybe you saw Citizen Kane, maybe you didn't. I really hope you did. I hope you get a chance to if you haven't. Citizen Kane is an outstanding movie. Don't worry at all. If you haven't seen the film yet, do not worry at all about the plot of the film. I don't like, you'll gather it, but I'm not asking you questions about the plot. Because, as I said last week's lecture, the film takes place in the late 1800s and then goes through about 1945 or 46 or something like that, 48 maybe. And it's told all in flashback. In fact, it's told like 5-6 different versions, or 4 or 5 different versions of this man's life. I'm not really interested in the plot for you guys. Okay, you may even be bored by the plot. What I want you to watch for, if you haven't seen the film yet, is how the story is told visually and sonically, if you want, or orally. Okay, the movie is really, really good in terms of its visual demonstration. Okay, still after all these years. Okay, it's a really well-crafted film in terms of its ability to communicate images and the storyline at the same time. And the key reason for that, for much of the film, is Orson Welles as director using wide-angle lenses. The wide-angle lens spreads the foreground space artificially, keeping the midground and the background spaces all in focus. And when they're all in focus, you can keep that spatial relationship between the image and the viewer can look around and see how that particular image is communicating meaning. And Wells was very crafty in doing this with his cinematographer, Greg Toland. And last week I went over some of the more interesting shots in the film that utilize wide-angle lens because it communicates. It's almost like a painting. And the key shot there was the shot of the boy whose life was being decided. This particular shot here, right? You may remember. That's all in focus. I mean, it's a little hard to see the boy. He's way in the back of the frame there. I mean, he's outside, but he's really there. That's not a matte shot or a trick shot. The kid is playing in the snow, and his future is being decided. The father he's in the background. The father is in the midground, begging that the mother doesn't sign the kid's life away to this banker as a guardian because they've come into millions and millions of dollars. The mother thinks the boy should not grow up out west in Colorado. The father may smack the kid around once in a while. The mother thinks that anybody who comes into such a fortune should be raised as a gentleman. Now, this scene runs for a few minutes long, and it's all stable, and you see ceilings, and you see real space, and you see real tension dramatically between this guy and this woman and the boy in the background. In other words, the visual image itself is communicating what's occurring, and audiences pick it up almost instinctively by the spatial relationships, not special, but spatial relationship between the actors who are in the real space. They're signing his life away in the foreground. The kid is in the background. The father is in the midground trying to argue for the kid's life. That's all taking place. So there's this real, actual dramatic tension within the scene, and it's realistically depicted because they're all there in one shot. That shot runs for a few minutes long, which is long. And the actors are first rate, and they hit their lines perfectly, and everything makes sense. But visually, this wide-angle lens spreads this space artificially and keeps the whole thing in focus. And it's lit realistically with real ceilings. And it gives the film a kind of presence. And it happens a handful of times throughout the film because what's happening in the image corresponds to the image itself. And that was a big step in movie making. Plus, there's beautiful sound bridges in the film. That is to say, transitions with a very, very vibrant use of sound to move from one image to the next. Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year, right? That happens as a sound bridge. There's a bird that squawks in a sound bridge. A bird makes a squawk, and we go from one scene to the next. There's a speech, a political speech that his friend starts talking about, and then the next image is Kane himself finishing that very speech. It livens up the audience. It uses something not just visual, but oral or sonic to help make the audience become propelled. Okay. The other thing about the film that's really dynamic is its use of storytelling. It's not it's told from 4 or 5 different perspectives. So no one perspective is necessarily more correct than the other. It's like a jigsaw puzzle that you have to put together. And the use of space is really well done a lot of times to not only show the visual tension between characters, but to isolate them. Later in life, Kane and his wife become sort of emotionally distant to each other, and they're shot very far away from each other in this large, large mansion that he owns. What Wells was able to do was to use visual imagery to help complement or tell the story itself rather than have actors just speaking. It was really, really a well-crafted film. And the use of shadows is really well done. He's this upstanding, good guy who wants to use this newspaper in the beginning of the film to help right wrongs that are happening in society. And when he goes to sign this document that it's called the Declaration of Principles, that he's telling his readers that he's going to be a good guy, he steps in darkness to sign it. And that's foreshadowing the idea that Kane character is not to be trusted. He's an egomaniac. He's kind of a nut job. When he yells at his second wife and he overpowers her, telling her she must go on singing, he completely puts her in shadow. She's completely in shadow. And that emphasizes her sense of doom. It's a really well-crafted film in terms of its visual usage. It really is. And the pages I had given you for the film allow for some further study along those lines. The flashbacks in the film are very, very well connected to the idea of a variety of storytelling. So you're not sure whose story to believe and you have to make your judgments as to which ones seem to be the most reliable. Okay, it's a very, very well crafted film. And there's one last question that I'm just ask you guys, and it's a relatively open-ended question, and you answer it as well as you can. Okay. So, a couple of things. It's now Wednesday night, just before midnight. Tomorrow, as I said before, would have been sort of your last class, but as it happens, it would have been reading day. But instead, what I'm going to do is, when I finish this video, I'm going to send out an email to this class with the final exam questions. The final exam questions will be due to me in an email attachment at next Thursday, May the 14th. Yes, 14th? Yes, May the 14th by midnight. Okay? And I will then grade that, and if you have any screening sheets that you haven't handed in, please hand those in. And I will have your final grades for you sometime after that, sometime that weekend or early in that week. So that's, it'll take me some time because I have 5 different classes. Okay. Now, a couple of other things. For those of you, there are still a couple of you out there that just I have not been able to get in touch with. Either through email or a second email or a telephone. I don't, I'm not sure what to say. I did the best I could, and you haven't contacted me. So, I know we're all going through a lot. I hope and pray that you and your family are safe. But if I didn't hear from you at all, there's not much I can do about that. I tried my best to reach everybody every time. All the videos are there on YouTube, my YouTube channel. They were always there before the class would have begun. They were always there on Wednesday night before the Thursday class. Every email is indicated what pages to look for in the textbook and so forth. So, you just have to do your best. If I could say a word about pre-registration, NCC, we're here for you. Okay, please let me know if you need help to think about what classes you may need for the fall or maybe even summer. All summer classes are online. We don't know exactly what's going to happen in the fall yet. It could be a combination of online and in class. I'm not sure. The governor came out today and was talking about that they're hoping to be open for business at this colleges and universities in the fall. So much still depends on the scope of the virus. But, I assume many of you are still going to be going to college in the fall, whether it's NCC or somewhere else. So, do me a favor, just go online to look at your degree evaluation, on ComNet. Find your degree evaluation, see where you stand, see what you might need. Do you need a math? Do you need English? Do you need a liberal arts? Are you a communication arts person? Do you need 200 level classes? Where do you stand? We need to have pre-registration numbers in the spring for the fall. For myself, I'm teaching 2 film studies courses in the fall. One is called American Film. It's not American Film Heritage. It's American Film. It's ComArts 157, and it's all independent cinema. Okay, all independent cinema. That's Tuesdays 1 to 4:15, just like this class, although this class was Thursdays. And on Thursdays, I'm teaching Com 256, which is Focus on the Director, which deals with auteurism, which we touched on a little this evening. And it's famous filmmakers over the years. And that is on Thursdays from 1 to 4:15. So, for those of you who might have gotten a kick out of this particular class, I'm teaching those 2 classes in the fall. Technically, I'm teaching Com 256 this summer as well, the auteur class. The first summer session, it's all online, so I'll have to use Blackboard and then maybe some clips on YouTube and stuff, but not too many people have signed up for it right now, so I don't know if it's going to go, but it is offered if you want to check it out. It technically starts in 3 weeks, but whether or not I'm going to get any takers, I don't know. I think people are just a little gun shy about pre-reg. But NCC, I mean, you know, everyone's working from home. We're doing the best we can to make sure everyone's needs are taken care of. Okay. All right. Well, listen, I miss you guys. I wish you the best through this finals week and summertime. You know where I am. Just give me an email. Just let me know who you are, what class you're in, and all that kind of stuff. And get back to me with this exam in an email attachment sometime next week. I'm going to wish you all the very best. Please stay safe and have a good evening.